Jean-Paul Zagarola is the Senior Program Manager for Bonneville Environmental Foundation. Jean-Paul has been supporting conservation and restoration efforts in Oregon since 2012. Jean-Paul cultivates diverse collaboratives to address complex socio-ecological problems and has a history of leveraging technical expertise, partnerships, and funding opportunities to support small nonprofits and tribes in the conservation work of the Willamette Valley and other regions in the state. Today, Jean-Paul is focused on strategies that mitigate the impacts of climate change and ecosystems and communities through the beaver-based restoration and wildfire resilience actions. When not at the office or exploring beavery creeks and wetlands, Jean-Paul likes to enjoy the recreational and culinary bounty of the Willamette Basin with his wife and two furry children.
Thanks so much, Becky, and thank you to SWC for hosting me today. So I'm going to be talking to you today about a collaborative called the Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership, and a little bit about why we formed, some planning and prioritization processes that we're going through right now, and what we're going to do with those in terms of supporting beaver in the Willamette Basin. So the Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership is made up of 5 watershed councils, Bonneville Environmental Foundation, and then staff from the natural resource departments of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde and Siletz Indian. And we've cobbled together a number of funding resources to support our work over the years. This is sort of our initial geography, our focus area. So it includes these 5 watersheds here, parts of Marion County. It's actually since expanded since the expansion of the North Canadian Watershed Council's work area. So it does include areas around Salem. This makes up a little over 3,000 square miles. About 30% of the Willamette Basin in that expanded area, probably about 6,500 perennial stream miles, and then a mix of private and public land. So the reason we were interested in working with Beaver is because these organizations and tribes, are focused on doing restoration, conservation, and addressing a lot of these issues that we see come up in our watersheds and in our streams due to a number of anthropogenic or human caused problems, and also because of the near extirpation of beavers during the fur trade. And that led to simplified streams, lowering of the water table, reduced groundwater, elevated peak flows during the rain season, so more flooding, low summer base flows due to drought, reduced riparian forest resilience against wildfire, and climate change is really just compounding all these issues. We're expected to get more flooding in the rain season, even more extended drought, and greater area and frequency of wildfire. The good news is that beavers are watershed superheroes, and we can collaborate with beavers, and so we can restore watersheds, and they do the work virtually for free compared to how we normally approach restoration. So beaver complexes essentially act as sponges on the landscape. They increase surface and groundwater and elevate summer base flows. They can dampen the effects of flooding. They can reduce the amount of sediment in the stream as you move downstream and improve water quality. They create diversity hotspots, so generate a lot of food resources for fish and wildlife. If you've ever walked a stream and happened upon a beaver pond or beaver habitat, you'll notice right away the change and the sort of the richness and productivity of that habitat versus an undammed area. They vastly improve salmonid habitat by really expanding the area of habitat that's available. And they provide refuge during wildfire, and in some cases can even provide a wildfire break when those beaver habitats are large enough. On the left is just a conceptual model of that sort of sponge effect that beaver habitats have. On the right are some studies that were actually conducted in Great Britain, where castor fiber, not Castor canadensis, lives, but they have virtually the same behaviors, and you can't tell them apart. There's some very specific genetics that where they diverged, many years ago. But anyways, they actually showed that you can see the red line in the area where beaver had moved in and dammed. They greatly dampened the flood event during the winter, whereas the blue line is the undammed area where you have a massive peak flow and flooding. And then over time, that water is released at a slower rate than in the undammed area. Unfortunately, there is a really great study in the city of Gresham showing this exact same thing, where the city's engineers they constructed wetlands, and beavers moved in and essentially ruined everything that they designed. But they actually had greater improvement of flooding and water quality as a result of the beavers coming in. So now they're actually working with the beavers to address those original goals that their designed wetlands were intended to achieve. Additionally, as I was saying before, that study showed that these beaver habitats were removing sediment out of the water column, including excessive nitrogen and phosphorus from the surrounding landscape. Just a couple other diagrams just showing showing that sponge effect again. Streams without beavers, are very susceptible to drought. As that water table drops, adjacent even agricultural production or vegetation will lose access to that water, whereas in a beaver influenced area, that water table remains fairly high throughout the summer. And there's several examples where an adjacent agricultural farm actually benefited from the colonization of beavers. And there are some advocates that are kind of going around and talking about the benefits they gained in having beavers on their property. This is a diagram based on a study that occurred in Eastern Oregon that showed a massive increase in production of salmonids when beavers moved in and built a series of dams in the creek. And this just shows all the different pathways where beavers provided enhanced habitat in order for fish to really bounce back in that particular stream system. As I mentioned, there's a lot of research that has occurred showing beaver habitats as wildfire refuge and wildfire breaks. There's someone in particular, Dr. Emily Fairfax, has done a lot of this research, done a great job communicating that research. And this is just some series of photos she had in one of her presentations showing this was a major wildfire, I think 2018, I believe. A virtually scorched earth in the surroundings. This is a big beaver complex here, and I think it was a BLM did a flyover to kind of assess what was going on here, and they spotted a little black thing there next to the bank of the river, and they kind of zeroed in. It turned out it was a bear, Smokey the bear there, taking advantage of this beaver refuge that they created in the midst of this massive catastrophic wildfire. Dr. Emily Fairfax also did a really cool stopgap animation film, just kind of simplifying the process in which beavers support refuge and breaks in wildfire. for all these benefits, the partners in Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership were interested in partnering in improving essentially both watershed and cultural capacity for beaver and their beneficial behaviors. At the same time, we recognize beavers can be divisive, and they can cause conflict, and we fully recognize that. And so we wanted to take a very strategic approach to promoting beaver and making sure that we address concerns and mitigate for any impacts that beaver have. So this is sort of just like a simplified conceptual diagram of that approach, which essentially starts with data collection analysis, kind of understanding a little bit about more about beaver habitats, where the landscape can support dam building. We want to know more from stakeholders and landowners how they view beavers, what are some of the barriers to maybe promoting beaver more. Then we can start developing some internal operational tools. So if someone has a beaver conflict, what can they do? What resources can we provide? Or if folks want beaver on their property, again, what can we do to support that effort? In addition, it's important that we outreach to the general public, do talks like this, and just get information out there about the good and the bad that beaver can do and what we can do about it. And then we feel like we can start moving into actually restoring habitat, promoting beaver on the ground, and doing beaver coexistence, which essentially just mitigating for some of those conflicts that beaver can cause. So starting with our data collection process, there's a tool out there called the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool. It's essentially a GIS-based model that will estimate the upper extent of beaver dam capacity for any stream on the landscape. So it'll tell us which areas can support the most beaver dams and which areas can't support any beaver dams. So we partnered with a research lab in Utah State University to essentially implement this tool. It not only tells us where beaver dam capacity is on streams, all streams in our focus area, but it'll also evaluate risk, where we would expect to find conflicts because of adjacent infrastructure, roads, or buildings, or certain land use types. Also, with Utah State University, we're test piloting a new version of this tool, which allows us to easily integrate other types of data into the model and collect field data to customize the results of the model specific to our region. This tool was developed out in Utah. Obviously, our ecosystems are a little bit different here. Vegetation being a big one, so we had to make some adjustments to that, but this version of the tool allows us to do that fairly easily. So this is essentially the base kind of model before there's any outside data inputted into that model. And this is kind of what, at least one version of what we'll see once we're done with this process, where we'll have every stream with an estimated dam capacity on that stream, and that'll be across our focus area here. So this isn't the final result, but just an idea of what it's going to look like. So as I was mentioning, we are collecting field data to essentially calibrate that model and validate the results. We did a sample of, we sampled the entire stream network in our focus area. And then we reached out to I think 1,600 landowners total. So we had about 1,600 reaches that we were looking at. And then we reached out to all the landowners that own property on those stream reaches. We ended up gaining access to 375 properties from 170 landowners, and have been surveying those stream reaches over the last couple of years. We also had to recruit essentially a team to help us collect that data. And, one of our interests, as I mentioned, was to engage the community or engage certain groups in that process. So we worked with the OSU New Beginnings for Tribal Students to recruit um, students that identify as Native American and are looking for like career opportunities and experience. And we hired three field techs through that program. We also worked with the Great Old Broads for Wilderness and had two great volunteers collect a bunch of data for us over actually this last summer. So kind of where we're at with that process. As I mentioned, we've had contact and are working with 170 different landowners to do those surveys. We've done over 90 surveys now, covering about 18 stream miles, and we've got a little bit more to go, but should be wrapping up that process here very soon. So just some photos from the last few field seasons. These are our field techs, very excited to see a beaver lodge there on the right and just excited to be out there. Best office that you could possibly have to go to. That's a photo of me, but this is a very cool beaver complex on Stout Creek in Marion County. Beaver are very active on Stout Creek, and they've done some very interesting engineering where they can't dam in the main stem Stout Creek just because the flow is too fast essentially. And so they, in certain areas, they will divert part of the river into the floodplain and then build dams and make their habitat in the adjacent floodplain with that diverted flow, which is pretty interesting and unique. And this is a really awesome spot here. This, I can't say for sure, but after the 2020 wildfire, this is an area that looked like it resisted further encroachment of that fire. You could see on the upper end of this habitat, the trees were burnt, and then on the downstream of this habitat, there was no charring whatsoever. So I don't think it actually stopped the fire, but it definitely resisted any burning that was going on. So just a unique spot. This is another interesting beaver dam. This is when we were first sort of surveying the area before we kind of got started. And this was just a unique dam, something neither of us had ever seen, where there was limited resources to build dams, but the beavers are opportunists, and they dragged in a wooden bench to make their dam, and even brought in and moved around boulders. They use whatever they can if the conditions are right to build a dam. So our next phase of this process to increase capacity for beaver on the landscape and culturally was the stakeholder engagement process. And we use a social science approach to do that. It's called community-based social marketing. And essentially what we're trying to do is understand certain perceptions and what different types of groups view as barriers to accepting a certain behavior, essentially. And so we're just trying to understand what the barriers are by group, and then develop strategies to directly address those barriers versus just sending out an information campaign to everyone and assuming that's going to be enough to change minds or get folks to kind of reach out to us to ask us for more information. So through that process, we conducted 13 in-depth interviews, 4 focus groups. We mailed out 1,600 fairly long surveys, and we got 400 back. Surprised we got that many. Is a pretty extensive survey. And then we work with just riparian private landowners, industrial timber, agriculture, public works departments, and irrigation districts. Those were all the groups that we did these survey methods with. So the interviews and the focus groups and the mailed surveys. So some key highlights from that process, we're still kind of putting that together and processing the data, but in general, it seems like there is appreciation for beavers and their benefits. We found that among most groups, in particular our rural residential groups, um, out of a list of concerns to their property that included things like invasive species, wildfire drought, among a number of others, wildfire and drought came up as the biggest concerns. We found out that language of certain terms really matters. So when we talk about coexistence, we mean alternatives to trapping and living with beaver, essentially. But for some of our participants in the stakeholder engagement process, coexistence meant not trapping until there's a problem. So we learn that we need to be a little bit more specific in our language when talking to certain stakeholder groups. There we found out that there's still a lot of misconceptions about beaver and myths out there, and so that indicates that there is a need for some information campaigns. We also, in particular with the agricultural stakeholders, um, we determined that what's going to be critical is developing pilot projects and showing other agricultural producers that this works. You know, the proof is in the pudding. You know, we could show a lot of the science, but unless people are seeing it in their own backyard, it's not very convincing. And then finally, there was a strong preference for a one-stop shop for resources. So in response, we are starting to develop our website so that there is a hub essentially for resources that people can go to when they have a problem or when they want beaver. So our next steps for the Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership, we're going to wrap up that habitat assessment, that data collection process. We have a little bit more field work to do, probably just a few more weeks of that. We're going to then do some data analysis and then start doing some reporting of the results. We're with the stakeholder engagement process, we're continuing to develop that website. We will do some information-based campaigns just to make sure that you know, the information is out there and we can start demystifying some of those misconceptions about beaver. We're going to continue with our outreach, largely using the results of these processes. Then we're going to integrate the results of both the habitat assessment and the stakeholder engagement process to develop beaver habitat management plans for each of the watersheds that are in our focus area. We'll publish those results and start developing some pilot projects in certain areas where we have the support to do that, as I was mentioning. And then we can start really moving into restoration and coexistence implementation. So implementation might be riparian and revegetation. So food is critical for beaver. If there isn't enough food, then they're not going to use the habitat. This is a photo of an area. It was an abandoned beaver meadow. I'm fairly certain the beaver were trapped out at one point. It turned into a reed canary grass floodplain. And over a couple of years, we controlled that reed canary grass and planted thousands of willow stakes. This is the early stages. It's been totally converted and we have a lot of established willow there now, and I'm already starting to see a bunch of beaver activity as a result. So another method to sort of encourage or enhance beaver habitat is through something called beaver dam analogs. The photos here on the left, these are just a basic diagram of what a beaver dam analog looks like. These are posts that are pounded into the stream channel, and then often some sort of either willow or some other vegetation weaved in between those posts. And it's essentially just mimicking a dam. Beavers can use those as starter dams, but often what happens is it is enough to slow down stream flow, and beavers will build around those dams. It is really low cost. You can have volunteers do this work. Doesn't require heavy equipment in most cases. And then the photo on the right is just an example of where, one BDA isn't enough. These aren't permanent structures. They're going to move and they're going to fall apart over time. But if you do several BDAs, you can actually start changing the geomorphology of the creek and creating wetlands. And then ideally, you have beavers that move in that will maintain this long term. If beavers don't move in, there will be a certain level of maintenance required to kind of maintain these structures essentially that are kind of diverting and reconnecting the floodplain. Another approach that we currently take is just installing log structures, and this is often done to promote fish habitat, but it also works for promoting beaver dam building. Essentially, it's just slowing down stream flow. This is an example in the Marys River watershed where there is a fairly incised creek, relatively high velocities during the rain season. Log structures were installed, and then a few years later, when we came out and surveyed, we started seeing a bunch of dam building around upstream and downstream of these structures. So in addition to enhancing habitat, encouraging beaver to colonize, there's going to be conflict, and there already is conflict, and there are alternative solutions to trapping that we can implement for that as well. So if beavers are chewing trees or adjacent vegetation, hazelnut trees or whatever valuable trees that you don't want beavers cutting down. One example is you can do basically a paint sand mix and paint the trunk of those trees. Beavers don't like to chew on those things, and so they'll avoid those areas. Also, you can fence individual trees like this exclusion fencing here, and that's very successful if it's done right. If you want to control the amount of flooding occurring, say a landowner is generally okay with having beaver on their property as long as they don't flood their house or some other important piece of their property, you can install this what's called a pond leveler to control the amount of flooding that's occurring. And this is a diagram from an organization that has done a lot of this in the past. And then here's an example of one that a group of partners installed at the Starker Arts Park in the city of Corvallis just recently, which was functioning pretty well to reduce the amount of flooding and duration of flooding at this public park. Additionally, beavers tend to want to build in constriction points like culverts. So you can create exclusion fencing in those areas. This is called a keystone fence, and will essentially, it'll prevent the beaver from choking off that bottleneck. And then finally, our last tool in the tool belt, in very specific instances, if the conditions are right, we can do some relocation or translocation. There are pretty strict rules on where we can do that. So it's often not a strategy we can use, but in some specific cases it may be. If the habitat is great, if there's minimal risk, if the landowners up and downstream are supportive, we can relocate maybe beavers that are causing conflict downstream, or areas that have relatively good habitat, but there are no beavers and we want them to colonize so that we can take advantage of those benefits downstream. The success rate is not great, but it's enough that it's about around 30 to 40% if it's done well. So it may not always be a solution, but it's definitely a tool in the tool belt. This photo on the right is an example of relocation we'd probably never do, but this was the Idaho Fish and Game back in the late 1940s. They actually did a bunch of airdrop they airdrop beaver into, I think it was national park or national forest, to recolonize this area. And there's an article recently that came out showed that it was actually surprisingly somewhat successful, and it has been recolonized by beaver with extensive beaver damming and ponding and wetland creation in that area. So that's all I've got for my talk today. Here are some additional resources on the left, and happy to answer any questions any of you may have. So salmon and beaver have co-evolved for, thousands of years. And so not every beaver dam may necessarily be permeable for salmon, but in most cases, they're going to make their way through that dam. There are certain situations that might not occur, but they're not mutually exclusive. And that is definitely something, a myth that we want to demystify. Yeah, actually, I conducted a survey there because I was working on a property there. I was managing a restoration there for about 3 years with the North Sandium Watershed Council, and noticed it was going dry in the summer, and just on this section of Bear Branch, it actually looked like a great spot to promote beaver. And so I think there are definitely some things to do. We've done some surveys there, and feel free to send me an email and we could talk some more. I would love to survey some more out there and see what might be possible. There are urban beaver. We have them here in Corvallis, where I'm based. They're in Gresham, as I was mentioning. I mean, they're everywhere. So using some of those mitigation strategies, we can, I think we can coexist. But in some areas, it's just, if you have to move beaver, then you have to move beaver. Ideally, we can use some of these alternatives, and it may take some tinkering, an initial install of like a pond leveler, and then kind of making adjustments so that as beaver make their adjustments, you're able to adjust with them. Ideally, there's funding to do that. In Benton County, they created a wildlife mitigation fund to address some of those things specifically. And I think part of the role of the Mid-Willamette Beaver Partnership is to make some of those resources more available to folks. But yeah, so I'd say they exist, and it's possible to coexist, but it's going to take a little bit of work. Yeah, I'm not an expert on all the rules around beaver, but the status for beaver was recently changed. So previously they were considered a predator on, I believe, agricultural land, and fur bearers on public land. They're not like a protected species. That status recently changed. I don't have the specific language for you on that. I should be more prepared with that next time. So there are some somewhat new protections. They are still allowed to be trapped, but there's some more rules that need to be followed. Trapping has to be reported, and in certain areas they can't be trapped just because it has to be because they're causing some specific conflict. They generally coexist. They feed on slightly different things, and so I wouldn't really say that if you have one, if like nutria are going, they're not going to be really competing with beaver. So in general, I know nutria is an issue, but not particularly for beavers or beaver habitat. Usually in the fall, they're most active kind of preparing for the winter harvesting. So when water levels are low, they might be damming in areas that you wouldn't even necessarily expect them to dam. Just because water's so low, they want to create that ponding habitat for themselves. So I'd say fall, and then also in the evening, I often will see them at dusk. They're nocturnal, so you're not going to see them much during the day. If they're in a big, safe pond, you might, get lucky and see one, and that's happened for me a few times. Yeah, there's so Heath was mentioning Beaverland earlier. That's a new one that came out. There's another really good one called Eager. And there's a ton of, scientific publications out there. Those resources I provided will kind of give you some basic background on beaver biology and things you can do to enhance habitat. And I would just recommend, other than those, just recommend doing a Google search and you'll find all kinds of stuff. It can vary. I've seen them in very small, restricted, limited areas, and they can also take over whole, mountain valleys. So like I was saying, they're opportunists. If they have a lot of land to work with, then they're likely able to support, maybe multiple colonies. If there's a little bit of land to work with, but still a food resource, ponding habitat that they use for refuge and protection, maybe a small family. There have been some estimates of like how many acres you need to support a family unit. I don't remember exactly what those are, but I think that they're very rough estimates, and it varies. I've seen so many different scenarios of beaver existing and surviving that it's hard to really say what they, in terms of area, exactly what they require. If they have food and cover, and essentially that's it, and they generally can exist. They may just be passing through, or if the areas supports those things well enough, then they'll reside in that specific area. Only are in some areas. I feel like we're just getting started promoting beaver habitat here in the Willamette, so it's not that common here. But in California, they've really embraced beaver as a tool and a partner for mitigating wildfire. There's a state mandate now to promote beaver and to coexist with beaver in California, to specifically address wildfire.